Hello there. Welcome to the Staroid channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I hope you're doing well. I'm trying to still fight off this flu, but I think I'm getting better every day, so that's a positive start. Now, we're on the story where Fern has moved into a beautiful house in Fairfield Close. It's called Fairfield House, and she's learnt that the people who used to live in this property 25 years ago abandoned the house one day and were never seen again. So she's trying to put the pieces together and to find out why it is that the Drifter family abandoned their house. So let's continue with our story, but before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with part 3 of our story. What sort of things would you hear Ruth saying to her husband? Oh, I'm really beginning to sound like a gossip, aren't I? I'm probably overreacting, dear. You know, she got upset about things, if they weren't so-so. I think she was a bit of a perfectionist. So I'd hear her saying, you need to clean this up right now, and don't leave your shoes in the hallway for someone else to trip over. Maybe it was all very benign. I don't really know, but it did give me pause for thought. Because if the truth be told, you don't really know what goes on behind closed doors, do you? No, I suppose you don't. So nothing strange happened before they finally up and left that stands out to you, perhaps? You're beginning to sound like a private investigator, love, asking all these curious questions. Why do you want to know all this? The Drifters left a long time ago. It's 25 years now. I guess I'm just fascinated about this mystery. Maybe I'm reading too much into this stuff and rather fancy myself as Nancy Drew or something. I mean, you have to admit, it makes absolutely no sense, people abandoning their perfectly lovely home like this, not to mention Russell Drifter, leaving his job as a butcher, just up and going in the middle of the night like that. It gives me the distinct impression that they were running away from something. It makes me think that something really bad must have happened here. This house has been on the market for over 25 years. Only now has it been purchased by me and my husband. They didn't sell up the place at once, nor did they maintain this house in any way. That too is profoundly odd. If you have an investment, you watch over it, don't you? Even if your pockets do so happen to be lined with gold. How many rich people do you know that would ignore and abandon a valuable asset like this, and just let it descend into ruin and decay? You ask some very good questions, dear, and you raise interesting points. Let me think. Well, now that I come to think about it, there was a day shortly before the Drifter family did abandon their house that Ruth incongruously arrived on my front doorstep, and she was as drunk as a skunk. That was a first, let me tell you. Ruth was the kind of woman that kept everything together. I'd never seen her inebriated a day in my life, and I preferred her drunk, because at least I could get to talk to her. Let's just say she'd never bothered to visit me before. But I guess if you're drunk, your inhibitions just float away, don't they? So why did she visit you like this? Fern asked. I don't know the answer to that question, love. I wish I did. She was giggling like mad. She had a bottle of wine in her hands that was almost empty. She was knocking it back like Coca-Cola. She was saying, Hello, Amelia. It's me. I bet you didn't think I'd visit you like this, did you? I'm so drunk. I'm so very drunk. I can hardly see straight. My head is spinning. Everything is going round and round and round. I can see that, Ruth, I said. You better come in, hadn't you? I thought you'd never ask, Amelia, she said, pointing at me. You haven't seen him, have you? I bet you haven't seen him. Seen who? I asked her. That is not for you to know, Amelia. You shouldn't be asking me that, she said, wagging her finger mischievously at me. But I'm telling you, he's there. He's watching me all the time. I don't suppose he watches you. But then you don't look like me, do you, Amelia? Red-blooded men always look at me wherever I go, and I hate it. You hear that? I hate it. I wish they'd stop staring. You know it's rude to stare, but he won't stop, and he's big, very big. I've seen him in the woods, you know. He's always spying on me, all the time. I think he wants me, Amelia, like men always want me, and I hate it. Why won't he go away? Why won't he leave me alone? Why does he keep staring at me? He keeps watching me. I'm not stupid, you know. I know exactly what's going on. Sorry, what are you talking about, Ruth? Is someone stalking you? If they are, Ruth, you should go to the police at once. You can file a restraining order against this man, whoever he is. Is that why you're drinking, Ruth? You're afraid of this man. You're trying to drown out your sorrows. You need to handle this with kid gloves, my dear. You must go to the police about this at once. A restraining order, said Ruth, bursting into fits of drunken laughter. A restraining order? You're hilarious. I'd like to see the police file a restraining order against him. They'd have their work cut out. They'd never catch up with him. Never. He's too clever for them. He's far too strong. Who is he, Ruth? I'm being serious. If he's bothering you and following you around, you need to be very concerned. There are some weird men out there. The way you're describing this man, well, he sounds very obsessive if you ask me. Those are the ones you need to worry about. You hear it all the time. Celebrities being pursued by obsessive men. There was a story in the papers once of someone stalking the Queen of England. The next thing you know, the man was in her bedroom. Then there was the case of Madonna's stalker. I remember the coverage about all that. These people aren't right in the head, Ruth. You must go to the police at once. He's always watching me, Amelia, spying on me. He wants me. I know he wants me. Are you saying he wants to harm you, Ruth? Is that what you're saying? No, he wants me, Amelia. He wants me so he can stare at me all day long. This is very concerning, Ruth. If what you're telling me is true, and it's not the drink talking, you need to do something about this at once. I hope you've spoken to your husband Russell about this, and you're not keeping this all to yourself. I may be drunk, Amelia, but I can still think. I know he's watching me all the time. I can't even walk my dog because he's there, stalking me. I like the exercise, but I'm scared to go into the woods now. I think he might grab me and take me away. I'm afraid of what he might do to me. This is very serious, Ruth. You must speak to Russell about this, I said. Russell doesn't know. He doesn't understand. Russell can't see him. But I know he's there. He's always watching, always waiting. I remember Ruth chuckled, dropped down on my sofa, and then fell fast asleep. I called Russell, Ruth's husband, over to the house, and he came to pick up his wife. He carried Ruth back home in his arms. She was out for the count, you know. He said he'd never known her to drink to excess like this before, but had noticed that recently she'd been rather agitated about something, and kept looking out of the window nervously, as if she was terribly afraid of something. When he asked her what was going on, she'd snap at him and say nothing was wrong. I told him his wife seemed to be worried that some man was stalking her, and that she should take such things very seriously and go to the police at once. But the following day, when I was in the butcher buying my meat from Russell, he assured me that his wife Ruth had told him she'd made the entire thing up to get some kind of reaction out of me. And no, nobody was stalking her. But then a week later, they just abandoned their house. Whether this is linked or not, as to why they did finally leave, God only knows. I will say this, though, Fern, that when she came over to my house that day, in such a dreadfully drunken state, I thought she might be crying out for help. Something was definitely causing her great disquiet."
"That is such a strange story," said Fern, "and I think it may be true. When people are overwhelmed, they often turn to drink, don't they? By the sounds of things, this woman was reaching out to you for help. Maybe someone really was stalking her, and her husband Russell may have realised what was going on. Perhaps the family felt threatened, so they all up and left. It now makes perfect sense to me."
"It's a possibility, dear. I don't deny that at all."
"I think it's a very definite possibility," said Fern insistently. "Maybe Ruth panicked and was scared this man was going to abduct her or something, so they decided to leave at once. I mean, this man was spying on her from the woods, so whoever he was, he may have been rather unhinged. Perhaps he'd escaped from a loony bin or something like that. Maybe he imposed a real danger to Ruth. You say yourself that she was a beautiful woman. Maybe he couldn't get enough of her. Obsession is a very dangerous thing. I'm surprised they didn't go to the police about this matter. But maybe they had their reasons. Ruth told you that the police would never catch up with him, didn't she?"
"I never thought of it like that, my dear. But goodness gracious, you do raise some interesting points. And you're absolutely right. I do know Ruth did not want to go to the police about this matter. She said that they would never be able to apprehend this stalker of hers. So now the dots are beginning to connect. Maybe the stalker imposed a very genuine threat to her, and so in her desperate fear she demanded the family left the house at once, in an awful hurry. And that is probably what they did. Russell would have done almost anything for that woman. He loved the bones off Ruth, but God only knows why. Personally, I never understood his devotion myself. But then again, we can't choose who we fall in love with, can we?"
The doorbell was very obtrusive. It was playing around and around the mulberry bush again and again. Fern was feeling really apprehensive about opening the door, but she reminded herself rather promptly that this was not Atlanta. Maybe it was Amelia from next door, popping around to ask her if she could borrow some milk. Amelia had become a firm friend of late, and all their discussions over the drifters and why they had abandoned Fairfield Place all those years ago had piqued Fern's curiosity. She was convinced that a stalker of some kind had made the family flee in a dreadful hurry, never to be seen again. As Fern thought about Ruth Stalker and her being left alone in this house with her husband on the other side of the ocean, she couldn't help but feel rather nervous about answering the front door this evening. "Don't be silly," she assured herself. "Even if Ruth Drifter was stalked by some low-life 25 years ago, if that man is still loitering around, what makes me even think he'd make a play for me? He's probably long gone anyway." Even so, it really rather ruffled Fern's feathers to consider that Ruth Drifter would have been subjected to a stalker in such an unassuming neighbourhood, such as Fairfield Close, where you wouldn't expect to meet the low lives of society. She had met the people that lived here, and this was a community of very friendly, warm people. Fern found herself ambling very reluctantly to the front door, and was stunned to see a strange man in the doorway, standing there with his wife and 3 young children. One looked like she was about 10 years old. The other 2 were probably between the ages of 7 and 8. "What the hell?" Fern thought. "Who the hell are these people? And why are they paying me a visit and standing outside my door at this time of the evening? Hello, can I help you?" she asked rather timidly.
"I'm sorry for this impromptu visit and to drop around so late. We were passing through the area," said the man. "I wanted my children to see the house where I grew up as a boy. I'm sorry we made quite a commotion, but my little girl insisted someone was home. She loved ringing your doorbell because she liked the tune. Might we just have a look around the house? We'll only be a few minutes. We don't want to trouble you. And then we'll be out of your hair, I promise. I've just told my children all about Fairfield House over the years. They've longed to see the place. And now that it's been fixed up, they'll get a much better idea of what the house looked like when I was a boy. You've done an excellent job in restoring the place. I understand it was in a bad state of repair for quite some time."
"Thanks," said Fern. I really appreciate that. My husband worked hard on this place to bring it back to scratch."
"He sure did."
Fern, who didn't like to turn down anyone, felt exceedingly apprehensive about this unexpected visit in the early evening. You heard stories, didn't you, of people who innocently, rather naively, let in strangers into their house, which soon became a scene of a grisly murder. This man, for all she knew, could be using his wife and kids as a convenient decoy, so that his appearance at her doorstep would appear benign, when it was anything but. In her head she had macabre visions of her blood being splattered all over the sofa, and the warning sirens were going off in her head. "Don't let them in. Don't be fooled by these people. It's not normal to pop around at the house at this time of the evening. Surely you know that, Fern." "I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but it is getting late. I'm not comfortable showing people around my home in the evening. I hope you can understand that."
"Please, ma'am, don't turn us away," chirruped the little girl. "I really want to see around Daddy's old house. He's told us all about it, and we're here now. We don't come to this part of the world very much. We only come around here once a year, and we really want to see it. Please, we'll only be a few minutes."
"Lara, didn't you hear what this lady was saying? Don't be rude, sweetheart. The lady is right. It is getting late, and we've turned up on her doorstep unexpectedly. We must go."
"But I want to see the house,"
Lara persisted, stamping her feet indignantly, and looking decidedly annoyed.
"Please, ma'am, please let us see into the house. My dad grew up here. I want to see where his bedroom is."
"Don't mind Lara," said the man apologetically. "She always kicks up a fuss when she doesn't get her own way. She takes after my mother in that way. I'm very sorry rocking up like this out of the blue. I hope I didn't cause you undue alarm. I'll be coming through the area next year. Maybe you could show us around then."
"This is my business card," he said, handing it to Fern.
"Now, kids, let's go, shall we? Leave the nice lady alone."
Fern could feel the family's bitter disappointment as they rather reluctantly walked back to their SUV. The people looked harmless enough. She saw the man putting a loving arm around the 10-year-old girl's back. She did feel pangs of guilt for turning them away, but it was ridiculous of them to rock up at her house at this time of the evening. She was right to be guarded. She briefly glanced down at the business card that the man had thrust in her hand and read the name, Rusty Drifter. She suddenly remembered that it was the Drifters that had lived in this house and abandoned it 25 years ago. Rusty Drifter had been 18 years old at the time. This man might have the key to the unsolved enigmatic mystery as to why the family up and left, so turning them away was almost nonsensical to her. The man seemed rather endearing, and he really had lived in this house, so it wasn't as if he was a total stranger after all. "Mr. Drifter! Mr. Drifter!" she called out after the man, who was now helping his wife into the big white SUV. He turned around to study Fern. She ran up to him. I'm so sorry I reacted the way I did, Mr. Drifter. I just got a shock, you were turning up out of the blue like this at my front door. And as my husband is away, he's a pilot, you see, I felt nervous being on my own. But I recognise your name on the card, and I realised my husband bought this house off you. You should have told me this. It changes everything. I'm sorry to have been so rude. Of course you can see the house. It did belong to you after all, and your family for many years, did it not?"
"But are you sure, ma'am? I really don't want to impose on you. Yes, it is true that Fairfield House is my family home, but it is no longer in our possession. But I've told the kids about it so much over the years, and Lara was begging we drop by, and then she persuaded me to knock at the door, and I just feel dreadful that I gave you such a scare."
"Oh, I'm so sorry that I reacted the way I did. Of course I'm sure," said Fern, managing a warm, encouraging smile. "Please follow me." Moments later, the Drifter family were trailing behind Fern into the house, and Lara was squealing with abject delight to see the house her father had grown up in all those years ago.
"Is this the staircase that you were telling us about?"
"Are these the banisters you used to slide down, Daddy?" she would ask. "And is this the cupboard where you hid from Kirsty when she couldn't find you anywhere?"
"It sure is," her father said, grinning from ear to ear, as they walked around the house together, and he pointed things out. "I see you've kept the wooden floors," he said approvingly. "You've polished them up superbly. The house looks just as I remember it did all those years ago. Although I will admit your kitchen deserves to have a full spread in a magazine," he said approvingly. "If my mother were to see what you've done to the kitchen, she would be very impressed."
If the truth be told, Rusty Drifter was rather surprised that Fern invited him back into his old childhood home. He hadn't felt remotely good about knocking on the front door at this time of the evening, to receive a somewhat frosty reception from Fern. His family had been passing through the area, and he'd taken a detour to the close to show his family the street where he'd grown up as a boy. The street lights had made things so much more obscure, but many features of the houses in the close had been hidden by a dark sky. He had wished with all his heart that he had brought his family to the close during the daylight hours, but his Aunt Hilda, who lived half an hour away from the close, had not stopped talking and talking. Thank God they visited her only once a year, as it was difficult to get away from the garrulous woman, who had made it virtually impossible for them to leave, always insisting they stay a little longer, and eventually it had got dark when they left for home, which was always the way it would seem. "Daddy, please can't we go to the close where you grew up as a boy? And maybe you can drive past your house. Please can we see it?" Lara had begged. "Please, Daddy."
"I'm not sure it's a good idea, love. It's a cold, dark evening. The new owners have only been living here for a couple of months now. I think it would be decidedly rude to just rock up at their front doorstep without any advance warning, don't you?"
"I don't think so, Daddy. I'm sure they won't mind. I'm sure they're very nice people and that they'll understand. I mean, we don't come to this part of the world very often, do we?" Lara had an ingenious way of manipulating her father, getting him to do exactly what she wanted him to do, and even his wife gave him an encouraging nudge on her daughter's behalf. "Oh, go on, Rusty. Don't be such a wet blanket. The children would really like to see where you used to live when you were a boy. You've talked about the place often enough, have you not? I mean, what harm can it do? The owner could just turn us away, but at least we will have tried." When Fern had answered the front door, Rusty had tried to smile at her warmly, but the poor woman's face had grown as white as a field daisy, which made him instantly regret their impromptu visit. He was rather embarrassed by the way 10-year-old Lara had been furiously banging on the front door and ringing the bell non-stop, especially when she heard the song Around and Around the Mulberry Bush being played. She kept pressing the ringer over and over again. He told her to stop, but she wouldn't listen. The new owner of Fairfield House seemed rather nervous about their presence, and he couldn't blame her for being affrighted. He had given the woman a card and said he'd pass by next year when the family visited Aunt Hilda again. The young woman, who he was later to learn was called Fern Estelle, had run after him and invited the entire family to see the house. Rusty and the family had eagerly accepted the kind invitation, and Fern had made them cups of hot chocolate and given them some shortbread cookies. She had then asked if she might have a word with Rusty all on his own, and then she had point-blank asked him the question that Rusty had never expected to hear coming out of her mouth. But there it was. "I hope you don't mind my asking you, Mr. Drifter, but now that you're here, I'm going to be very blunt."
Please call me Rusty."
"I really need to ask you this, and you can tell me to mind my own business if you like. But believe it or not, before you showed up tonight, I'd been thinking about your family an awful lot, and then there you are on our front doorstep. It seemed rather serendipitous."
"You've been thinking of us a lot?" said Rusty. "But why? I don't understand. We don't even know each other."
"You could just say I have an inquiring mind, and your family's rather bizarre story intrigued me. It's like a mystery I want to solve, and with you here, I'm hoping you can help me solve it."
"What mystery is this that you're talking about?"
"I understand from Amelia, she's the old woman that lives next door to me, that you were 18 years old when you left this house. She said one night your family up and left without so much as a bye or leave. Do you mind me asking why? If it's too personal, you don't have to tell me, but I'd love to hear your story if I may. Amelia told me your mother thought somebody was stalking her at the time. She was terribly afraid of this horrible man, who she thought might impose a danger to her. Is that why you all left? Amelia encouraged her to go to the police about this man. But then later your father said she denied that anyone was stalking her at all, and claimed she'd made the stalking story up. But I don't think people make up stuff like that. I think she genuinely was being stalked. What really happened? Is that the reason you up and left the way you did? Before Rusty could guard his words, he said rather abruptly,
"It wasn't a stalker that was troubling my mother. It was a Bigfoot. We left on the night this Bigfoot abducted her. She managed to escape his clutches, but we knew he'd be back for her again to try and abduct her. He was obsessed by my mother, you see. He wanted to keep her like a beautiful ornament or a trophy, a piece of artwork, you could say. My mother was a very beautiful woman, you see, with the whitest skin you've ever seen in your life, dark hair and blue eyes. She was striking. She turned heads wherever she went. But even a male Bigfoot seemed to appreciate her beauty. She told me when the Bigfoot abducted her, he kept touching her skin and marvelling at its perfection. He was staring at her as if he thought she was the most beguiling thing he'd ever laid eyes on, and was treating her very delicately, like you would treat a china doll, as if he was afraid that my mother would break. I know the story seems rather far-fetched and unbelievable, but I assure you it's true. I saw the Bigfoot myself take her into the woods on that fateful day. There was no doubt the Bigfoot was fixated over my mother. That was clearly apparent."
"You're joking," said Fern sceptically. "Are you actually telling me this is true? I mean, are Bigfoots even real? Or is this some kind of a wind-up?"
"This is no joke. I'm not very good at jokes at the best of times, I have to say. But I appreciate your skepticism. In the beginning, my mother felt very afraid of telling anybody about what was irking her. But we noticed she stopped going into the woods for her daily walks, as if she was afraid of something. She didn't feel we would believe her story, and it turns out she was absolutely right about that. When she first told us a male Bigfoot was fixated on her and was stalking her, and she was scared for her life, we all just laughed at her. Well, we thought this was one of her wacko jokes. My father definitely thought she was pulling his leg. Let's just say most people living here at Fairfield Close did not like my mother. They felt she was cold-hearted, aloof, and vain. A woman who kept herself to herself and came across as a bit of a snoot. People thought she was haughty and stuck up, but that was the impression she gave the world. She was not like that behind closed doors. My mother in real life was a kind, loving woman. She had a wicked sense of humour. She was one of those people that would carry on a joke for days on end, and then she would say, "I was only winding you up," just like when she told me I was going to boarding school. At the time, I was absolutely devastated, because the last thing I wanted was to be a boarder. I would go off into my bedroom in such a huff, slamming the door behind me angrily, and this went on for many days. My mother cracked up laughing days later and said, "I had you going, didn't I, Rusty dear? You fell for it hook, line and sinker. You should have seen your face. What are you like? Of course I'd never send you to boarding school." When my mother went on about a Bigfoot stalking her, my father really believed she was pulling his leg. These were the typical kind of jokes my mother would pull on us, and we had grown very weary of them. He would say to her, "I know, love, you enjoy turning men's heads wherever you go, but I don't believe for a single second a Bigfoot would be interested in you, if they existed, that is. And I'm sorry, love, I don't believe they do. But it's a good wind-up, I'll give you that."
Do I look as if I'm making this up? I'm telling you, a male Bigfoot is stalking me. I'm not joking about this. Why the hell won't you believe me? I'm being deadly serious.
Because, sweetheart, you can only cry wolf so many times, and I know you with your wicked sense of humour. This is the sort of thing you joke about, and you don't fool us for a second."
"So you're saying the stalking was real?" asked Fern, focusing on Rusty's story with wide eyes. "The man who was stalking her was a male Bigfoot. That's what you're saying?"
"Well, that was what she was implying. But I thought, like my father and like Kirsty, my sister, that she was winding us all up. Until one day I saw a huge Bigfoot peering through the kitchen window, obviously to look at my mother. But when he saw me, he hurriedly glided away. I don't think he was best pleased to have seen me. I was in such a shock, I remember saying to myself, 'Did I see that? Or did I see that?' I almost doubted myself, I have to say."
"Goodness gracious me! That must have been scary."
"Well, it was and it wasn't. Because when I first laid eyes on that male Bigfoot, it happened so very quickly, I thought I had imagined it all. But on the day the male Bigfoot abducted my mother, I was in no doubt then as to what was happening. I called my father at the butchery, where he worked, to tell him that my mother had been abducted by a male Bigfoot in the middle of the day. He laughed at me down the phone. 'So you are in on the wind-up as well, are you, son? Your mother decided she couldn't pull the wool easily over my eyes with her nonsensical joke, so she asked you to join her in this little game of yours. I'm sorry, son, but I'm not buying any of it. Your mother's pulling my leg again, and this time it ain't going to work. You're good, son. You almost had me going for a second, I'll admit that."
"Dad, you've got to believe me," I insisted. "I'm not making any of this up. This isn't a joke. Mum has been abducted by a male Bigfoot in the broad daylight."
My father began to laugh. He said, "You're good, son, I'll give you that. But I'm a busy man. I've got serious stuff to do. If you want to go playing silly games with me, wait until I get home tonight." He then put the phone down on me rather abruptly. I didn't know what to do. My mother had been abducted by a male Bigfoot and taken into the woods, while she'd been in the yard planting some seedlings. At the time, I'd been doing some work at my desk in my bedroom. I had gone into the kitchen because I was thirsty, to get myself a glass of water. I was standing over the kitchen sink, and had turned on the faucet to fill a beer glass with water, which I began to drink. That was when I noticed my mother in the yard, with a huge Herculean-sized figure standing at her side. I remember thinking, "What the hell? Am I seeing right?"
"What did you see, Rusty?"
"Well, I saw the Bigfoot, didn't I? I watched my mother looking up at him. She was planting a seedling in the ground. The Bigfoot gently took the last seedling from her, would you believe it, and tucked it into the soil for her. Then he simply threw her over his shoulders and began to walk away very fast. I could see my mother kicking and trying to fight back, but the Bigfoot held her down with one powerful arm and just glided into the woods, moving at the speed of light, with such a nimble grace for one so big. The most bizarre thing of all is I don't believe my mother screamed. She told me later that she was too affrighted, that nothing came out of her mouth, but just a whimper."
"What did the Bigfoot look like?"
Fern asked. "Well, he was huge, wasn't he? Absolutely enormous. My mother looked like a china doll on his shoulders, as if she could break into 100 pieces. If he were to drop her, that is. It's hard to describe his gargantuan size. He was ripped, had massive shoulders, overlong arms, and an incredibly human-looking face."
"And I imagine he was covered in hair, was he?" Fern asked.
"But of course. The hair was a very dark brown colour, almost black, you could say. My mother said he didn't smell putrid like they say in Bigfoot encounters. She said the smell was woodsy and earthy, and it wasn't unpleasant."
"So how did you react when you saw this thing?"
"Well, I ran after the Bigfoot, didn't I? With my father's baseball bat. But what good did that do me? I was no match for this Bigfoot, even if I could keep up with him. So that was when I returned home to call my father, to get his immediate help. But he was useless as well. You didn't think to call the police? Are you kidding me? Absolutely not. If my father wouldn't believe my unlikely story, neither would the police.
Good grief, what did you do? You must have felt completely hopeless. Your mum was missing, and your account over her disappearance sounded so incredulous, too incredulous to be real.
I searched the woodgrove frantically, calling out my mother's name in vain. It was a thankless, fruitless task, I have to say. She was long gone by then. I waited rather impatiently on tenterhooks, you could say, for my sister Kirsty and my father to return home. They did not believe me that a Bigfoot had abducted Mum, even though they could see I was in floods of tears, but that didn't seem to make any difference to them. My dad was not remotely amused by my antics. Actually, he was rather pissed, I think. He knew my mother had complained that a Bigfoot had been stalking her a while back. He didn't believe her claims then, and he wasn't about to believe my claims now, that she'd been abducted by the critter. He believed my mother had recruited me to help her pull his leg, so that she could laugh out loud at his expense, and he'd had enough of being taken for a fool. You're carrying on this charade, are you, son? While your mother is probably having dinner with Tiffany, her girlfriend, while she hopes I fall hook, line and sinker for this ridiculous game of yours. I will sit here and relax in the lounge, make myself a nice drink, while I wait for your mother to return home. This time I'm not going to bite the bait. Your mother has taken me for a mug far too many times to count, and I've had enough of these jokes of hers. They aren't even funny anymore. Word of advice, son, if you want to pull off a more convincing joke, you need to be a little bit less obvious when you go about it. If you said your mother had been abducted by a strange man, I might have believed that. But a Bigfoot, that's a push. It's stretching the imagination far too far, even for me, as gullible as I may be. If you want to make a joke convincing, son, at least try and make it believable, will you?
Goodness gracious me, you must have been so frustrated, Rusty. Your mother had really been abducted by a male Bigfoot, and your father and your sister didn't believe a word of it. They thought it was a joke.
Well, I was beginning to pull my hair out. I was champing at the bit, because I was so frustrated. I so wanted my sister and father to believe my account. That's the problem when you've cried wolf too many times. My mother was one of those people. She would carry on a joke for days on end, and then pull the wool over our eyes and have a good old laugh about it. And so was it really any surprise that my father doubted my story? My sister Kirsty thought I was being pathetic, going along with it. She rolled her eyes in the back of her head and said, "Bigfoot! Oh, for goodness sake, Rusty! I can't believe you went along with this joke of Mum's. Honestly, do you really expect us to believe she's been abducted by a Bigfoot? We're not that gullible, you know." The story does get more bizarre, because just when I thought I'd never see my mother again, there she was. She let herself into the house. She looked like she'd been dragged through a hedge backwards. There were scratches all over her face. Her pants were ripped. There was dirt all over her clothes. She was panting furiously, and her eyes looked very anxious. She was trying to say something, but at first nothing came out of her mouth, because she was shaking like a leaf.
"So what did your father do?" asked Fern. "I guess he still didn't believe her story. Is that what you're going to tell me?"
Of course he didn't believe her. He cracked up laughing, and then he clapped his hands and said, "Well done, Ruth. You should go to Universal Studios, shouldn't you, and apply for an acting job. You're very good. I almost believed your stunt. Now that's a raw talent. I suppose you're going to tell us that Bigfoot abducted you, and you managed to escape his clutches. How long did it take you to dress up for the part? I've never seen your hair look so wild like this, but I kind of like it. I could get used to your being rather dishevelled. It's growing on me." Finally my mother spoke in a very tight voice.
"This is not a joke, Russell. Look at me. Look at the state I'm in. Have you ever seen me shake like this? I am in
In an absolute state, Russell. You have no idea what has happened to me. I cannot believe that I was abducted by a Bigfoot. And you're acting like it's nothing, as if it hasn't happened, as if I've been making this all up. This happened to me, Russell. You've got to believe me. And he might come back and abduct me again. He's fixated on me, I'm telling you. I'm scared, very, very scared. We need to leave this house at once, before that Bigfoot comes back. There is no time to lose. You have got to believe me. This is not a joke. I told you a while back a Bigfoot was stalking me, didn't I? You didn't believe me then. And now you don't believe me now. But I have been abducted by a Bigfoot, and I was very lucky to escape him. And all you do is sit there gloating as if it's all just a big game to you. This isn't a joke, Russell. You've got to believe me.
Let me guess, said Fern. Your father didn't believe a word of it.
No, he didn't. My mother was in such a dreadful state. She marched into her bedroom and began to pack her suitcase, because if my dad wasn't leaving, she was. My father believed it was all an act. But when she continued to look outside the window very nervously as she packed her suitcase, in such a dishevelled state, he suddenly became more solemn. You're saying this isn't a joke then, Ruth? You're saying a Bigfoot really abducted you? Please tell me that this is not a wind-up. I need to believe you.
It isn't a wind-up. Does it look like it's a wind-up?
Do you think this is a wind-up? Do you really believe that I'm acting? I'm not this good an actor, you know. I may be many things, but I have never felt like this before. You have no idea, Russell, what I've just been through. And the least you could do is believe me. By the time my father did believe my mother, it was getting dark. And then my father saw the male Bigfoot standing there yards away from the house. He freaked the hell out. We all got out of the back window, headed for the car, and drove away as fast as we could.
So your father was afraid when he saw the Bigfoot, was he? Was he terrified?
He was absolutely petrified, especially as the Bigfoot's eyes were fixed on the house. And that was enough for him, let me tell you. He needed no further persuasion from my mother. We got into our car, drove all the way to Atlanta to stay at his parents' house, and decided to never come back. My mother was a wealthy woman, so we didn't have to look back. But she did send a removal company out here to forward us our stuff and to throw out what we no longer needed.
Did your mother tell you what happened to her when she was abducted by that male Bigfoot, and how she managed to escape him? Asked Fern curiously. I mean, that must have been a fascinating story.
Of course she told me all about it.
So there we are, that's the end of part 3. Part 4 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.